"Arrest that nurse!" Judge Malcolm Voss's voice cracked through the packed courtroom like a gunshot, his finger leveled at Emily Brooks like she was the most dangerous thing in the room. Deputies scrambled. The gallery erupted. Emily stood in faded blue scrubs, 31 years old, no lawyer beside her, no one in her corner. And she didn't move an inch. Then the rear doors of the courtroom exploded open. Military police flooded the aisles in full federal authority, boots thundering on marble, and the lead officer walked straight past the judge's bench, straight past the deputies, and stopped directly in front of Emily. He raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute. The room went absolutely silent. Judge Voss's face drained of color. Because the warrant the MP commander was holding didn't have Emily's name on it, it had his. If this story already has you locked in, follow along, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. Emily Brooks had worked the overnight shift for 4 years without complaint, and that alone should have told the administration at Greyhaven Medical Center something. Most people didn't last 2 years on the veterans ward without burning out or transferring to somewhere quieter. Somewhere the patients didn't wake up screaming at 3 a.m., didn't arrive with wounds that paperwork couldn't properly describe, didn't look at the ceiling for hours like they were waiting for something that was never going to come back. Emily understood that look. She'd had it herself. She'd spent 6 years as a U.S. Army combat nurse deployed through 2 theaters, 2 mass casualty events, and 1 extraction she was still not cleared to talk about. When her contract ended, she didn't go home immediately. She spent 3 additional months in a field hospital in a place with no electricity and too many children because there was no one else with her skill set who was willing to stay. When she finally came back to the States, she applied for the first civilian nursing position that put her near veterans. Not because anyone asked her to, because it was the only place that felt like she was still doing something that mattered. Greyhaven Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Ashridge, a mid-sized city in the valley where the winters were hard and the city council meetings ran longer than they should. The hospital was state-funded, partially contracted to serve a veteran population that had been growing steadily for 15 years. On paper, it was well-resourced. It had a new administrative wing, a renovated lobby, a public-facing Veterans Services Department that put out a glossy annual report every December with photographs of smiling staff and grateful patients. In practice, the Veterans Ward was understaffed, undersupplied, and buried under a procedural layer that seemed specifically designed to slow everything down. Emily had learned to work around most of it. She advocated loudly for her patients when she had to, quietly when loud didn't work, and she kept detailed personal notes on every unusual administrative decision that crossed her desk. Not because she planned to do anything with them, because her Army training had made documentation a reflex. Write it down. Write down who said it, when they said it, what the exact words were. Write down what happened next. She almost threw those notes away twice. The first time things started to feel genuinely wrong was in November, when she noticed that a cluster of veterans on her ward, 7 patients across 3 weeks, had been discharged with incomplete treatment plans. Not just incomplete, incorrect. Their files documented procedures that hadn't been performed, medications that hadn't been administered, follow-up referrals to specialists that didn't exist under those names in any system Emily could find. She flagged it internally. The charge nurse told her she'd look into it. Nothing happened. She flagged it again through the formal incident reporting system. 2 days later, her access to those specific patient files was quietly revoked. That was when Emily stopped treating it as a paperwork problem. She started cross-referencing. It took her 3 weeks of off-hours work, pulling every record she still had access to, mapping the discharge dates against the billing codes, against the names of the attending physicians, against the administrative override stamps that had authorized the early discharges. What she found was not a clerical error. It was a pattern, consistent, deliberate, and worth a significant amount of money if someone was billing the federal government for treatments that hadn't happened while simultaneously pushing patients out the door before those treatments could be documented as incomplete. The money had to go somewhere. Emily followed the billing codes to a private contractor, Harwick Defense Medical Solutions. She didn't recognize the name, but when she ran it against the public contract database, Harwick had a $12 million annual contract with the federal government to co-manage veteran healthcare services at 4 facilities. Greyhaven was one of them. She sat in her car in the hospital parking garage at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, staring at that number, and thought about the 7 veterans who'd been discharged early. She thought about the ones she hadn't caught. She thought about how long this had probably been running before she arrived. She brought it to Richard Alderman, Greyhaven's hospital director, the following morning. She had printed everything, organized it by date. She'd kept her voice level and professional because she'd learned long ago that the moment a woman raised her voice in a room like that, the message disappeared behind the tone. Alderman listened with his hands folded on his desk and his expression the specific blank of someone who already knows what you're going to say before you say it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're describing a billing irregularity," he said. "I'm describing systematic fraud against veterans and the federal government," Emily said. "You're a floor nurse," Alderman said. Not unkindly, almost gently, which was somehow worse. "You're not a billing auditor, you're not an investigator, and frankly, you don't have the full picture of the administrative arrangements we have in place with Harwick. This is above your pay grade, Emily. I mean that as an observation, not an insult. I have documentation. Leave the documentation with me." She didn't leave the documentation with him. She made copies of the copies. She went home that night and she sat at her kitchen table for a long time, and she thought about what it meant that a hospital director's first response to evidence of veteran healthcare fraud was to tell a nurse she didn't understand the full picture. Then she thought about the encrypted contact protocol she'd been given when she separated from the Army, a direct line to a federal military health oversight body. Not a hotline, not a public number, not something she'd ever expected to use. She'd been told it existed in case she ever encountered something in a civilian context that directly threatened the welfare of active duty or veteran federal patients. She'd been told the response time could vary. She'd been told to use her judgment. She picked up her phone. She sent a single encrypted message with her credentials, a summary, and a file attachment of the core documentation. Then she went to bed, because she had a morning shift and her patients still needed her regardless of what happened next. She didn't hear back immediately. She hadn't expected to. What she didn't expect was what happened at work 3 days later. Alderman called her into his office at 7 a.m. before her shift started. The head of HR was there, a man named Philip Greer, who Emily had spoken to exactly once in 4 years and who had the energy of someone who had prepared very carefully for a conversation he expected to go badly. There was also a woman Emily didn't recognize, mid-40s, expensive suit, a tablet in her hand, who was introduced as a representative from Harwick's legal compliance team and who did not offer her name. "We've completed a review of the concerns you raised," Alderman said, "and we've also conducted a review of your patient interactions over the past quarter." Emily's eyes moved to Greer. Greer was looking at his paperwork. "We've identified several instances where your conduct toward patients and their family members was inappropriate, including unauthorized disclosure of patient information and deviation from prescribed care protocols." "That's not true," Emily said. "We have signed statements." "From whom?" Nobody answered that question. "Emily," Alderman said, "I want to be fair with you. I want to give you the option to resign with a neutral reference rather than—" "I'm not resigning," she said. There was a pause. The woman from Harwick's legal team typed something on her tablet. "Then we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately, pending a formal misconduct investigation," Alderman said. "During the investigation, you are prohibited from contacting patients, staff, or accessing any hospital systems. You'll need to surrender your badge." Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 6 things she could say. She said none of them. She reached into her lanyard, pulled her badge, and set it on his desk. "You have my personal notes from the past 3 months," she said. "You don't have my copies." She walked out. In the hallway outside Alderman's office, she passed 2 nurses she'd worked with for years. Both of them looked at the floor. She didn't blame them. She kept walking. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for 8 minutes before she could get herself to put the key in the ignition. Not because she was going to cry, she wasn't, but because she needed to get her hands to stop shaking. They'd shaken worse than this. She'd held people together in worse conditions than a parking lot in Ashridge, and she knew the shaking was just adrenaline, just biology, just her body processing something her mind had already moved past. She drove home. She made coffee. She scanned and uploaded a second set of documentation to a secure cloud partition she'd set up 2 nights before. Then she started making a list of every federal reporting option available to her, because she was going to need to know which ones to pursue while she waited to hear whether her encrypted contact had gone anywhere. She didn't have to wait as long as she'd thought. The next morning brought a certified letter from the office of Judge Malcolm Voss, Circuit Court, Ashridge, notifying her that she was the subject of a civil lawsuit filed by Greyhaven Medical Center and Harwick Defense Medical Solutions alleging professional misconduct, breach of confidentiality, and defamation. The lawsuit sought damages and a court injunction preventing her from discussing hospital operations, patient records, or the Harwick contract with any third party. Emily read the letter twice. She set it on her kitchen table next to her coffee. She took a breath. She called a friend from her Army days named Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, who had separated from service 2 years before her and was now working in private security consulting. She didn't call him for legal advice. She called him because he was the only person she trusted to tell her the truth without sugarcoating it. "They're trying to box you in legally before your report goes anywhere," Webb said. "The injunction's the real play. If they get it, you can't talk to the feds without being in contempt." "How fast can they get it?" "If Voss is the judge, he could sign it tonight." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Marcus," she said, "I sent a contact report 3 days ago." He was quiet for a moment. "Through your separation protocol?" "Yes." "Then sit tight," he said. "Don't sign anything, don't talk to anyone from the hospital, and don't go back there." She hadn't planned to. What she hadn't anticipated was the call she got the following afternoon from a reporter at the Ashridge Tribune named Dana Ferris, who told her, politely, professionally, that she had received a tip from the hospital's PR department indicating that a former employee was under investigation for improperly accessing veteran patient records. And did Emily have any comment? Emily had no comment. She hung up, and 30 minutes later the story was online. Former Greyhaven nurse faces misconduct probe over patient record access. Her name, her photo, a professional photo from a community healthcare article she'd done 2 years prior, the hospital's statement expressing concern for patient privacy. A quote from Harwick's legal compliance team calling the situation deeply troubling. No mention of the fraud report. No mention of the veterans who'd been billed for treatments they never received. No mention of Harwick's government contract. She turned off her phone and sat very still in her apartment for a while. The summons arrived the next morning. She was ordered to appear before Judge Malcolm Voss in 3 days to respond to the civil suit and to show cause why the injunction should not be granted. There was a note from a court clerk informing her that given the nature of the allegations and her status as a former government contractor, a characterization that was technically true but deeply misleading, the judge had ordered her to appear in person and had prohibited her from filing any responsive documents electronically. She was going to have to walk into that courtroom with nothing but herself and whatever the truth was worth. She showed up on the appointed morning in the only professional clothes she still owned that fit, dark slacks, a plain blouse, because her scrubs weren't appropriate, and she didn't have money for a suit, and she was not going to pretend to be something she wasn't to impress a judge, who had apparently already decided she was something to be managed. She had a folder. It contained printed copies of her core documentation, a timeline she'd written out by hand because she thought better in ink than on screen, and a single page that listed the names of the 7 veterans she'd originally flagged, with their discharge dates and the billing discrepancies she'd personally verified. She also had folded into a sealed envelope in the inside pocket of her jacket a written record of her encrypted contact report, the message she'd sent, the timestamp, and the acknowledgement code that had been automatically generated when the message was received by the federal system. She didn't know if anyone had acted on it. She didn't know if anyone was going to walk through that door, but she'd learned a long time ago that you didn't carry evidence you weren't prepared to use. The courtroom was busier than she'd expected. Gallery seats were more than half full. Reporters, she realized, recognizing Dana Ferris from the Tribune in the second row. Several men in suits she didn't recognize. A few people she couldn't read at all. The hospital's legal team occupied a full table. 3 attorneys, a paralegal, and the woman from Harwick's compliance team who still hadn't told Emily her name. Emily sat alone at the respondents' table. Judge Malcolm Voss was 63, broad-shouldered, with the particular bearing of someone who had held authority long enough to mistake it for intelligence. He settled into his chair with the unhurried weight of a man who already knew how this morning was going to go. The preliminary motions were procedural. Emily answered questions directly, without elaboration, because elaboration required trust, and she didn't have any to spare in that room. The hospital's attorneys argued their position with smooth confidence. The injunction request was presented as a matter of patient protection and institutional integrity, and Emily watched two of the reporters in the gallery writing things down. Then Voss leaned forward. "Ms. Brooks," he said, in the tone of someone correcting a persistent misunderstanding, "you are a floor nurse. You are not an investigator, an auditor, or a federal agent. The records you accessed and copied were not within the scope of your clinical responsibilities. The court finds the hospital's position on this matter reasonable and—" "Your Honor," Emily said, "I have documentation of billing fraud against veteran patients that I'm required by federal law to report. An injunction preventing me from doing so would itself constitute—" "You are out of order," Voss said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in the way that usually made people stop talking. Emily didn't stop. "The Federal Acknowledgement Code I received confirms my report was received and logged. Any court order seeking to prevent me from cooperating with a federal investigation would be—" "Deputies," Voss said, and the word came out with a specific quality, measured and deliberate, the kind of deliberate that meant he'd been waiting for a reason. He pointed at Emily. "Arrest that nurse. Take her into custody pending contempt proceedings." The gallery went loud. Two deputies moved toward her. Emily stood, and she didn't back up, and she didn't reach for anything, because she'd been in situations where the wrong movement got someone hurt, and she knew exactly how to stand so that didn't happen. The rear doors of the courtroom opened, not the front, not the side entrance. The rear doors, the ones that led from the public hallway, burst open with a force that wasn't violence, but wasn't gentle either, and the room turned in one motion because that sound and that energy and the sight of federal military police in full uniform moving in formation down the center aisle was not something a courtroom full of civil proceedings attorneys was prepared for. There were 6 of them. The lead officer was a woman, mid-40s, combat decorations on her dress uniform, the specific kind of economy of movement that came from having done things in places that most of the people in this room would never be cleared to know about. She walked to the center of the courtroom, and she did not look at Emily yet. She looked at Judge Voss. She held up a federal warrant. "Judge Malcolm Voss," she said, and her voice carried without effort. "I am Commander Patricia Dahl, United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. This court is now operating under federal jurisdiction in connection with an active investigation. I have a federal warrant for your detention pending formal charges." Voss's face did something Emily had never seen a judge's face do. It went blank. Not the blank of composure. The blank of a man whose entire architecture has just been removed out from under him. "You cannot—" he started. "Judge Voss," Commander Dahl said, "you have the right to remain silent." Then Commander Dahl turned. She looked at Emily, and something in her expression shifted. Not softly, not sentimentally, but with the specific recognition of one person who has served in a very particular way, acknowledging another who has done the same. She raised her hand in a salute. Emily stood very still. The deputies who had been moving toward her had stopped. The gallery was absolutely silent. The reporters were not writing anymore. They were watching. And Emily, who had been fired, sued, publicly accused, and ordered arrested in front of a room full of people who had believed every word of it, stood at the respondent's table in clothes that weren't quite right for the occasion, with a folder of documentation she'd spent 3 weeks building alone in her apartment, and returned the salute. The sealed evidence packages that the federal investigators brought in were set on the judge's bench, not the respondent's table, not the gallery, the judge's bench, where Voss's hands were already shaking. "The charges," Commander Dahl said to the room, to no one specifically and therefore to everyone, "include conspiracy, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and fraud involving federal military healthcare funds." The hospital's legal team had gone very quiet. The woman from Harwick's compliance had her phone out. The paralegal was staring at the table. One of the deputies looked at Emily, then at Commander Dahl, then back at Emily. "Ma'am?" he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Emily picked up her folder from the table. She tucked it under her arm. She exhaled once, slowly, through her nose. Out in the gallery, Dana Ferris had stopped taking notes. She was staring at Emily with the specific expression of a journalist who has just realized the story she printed 3 days ago was the wrong story entirely. Across the courtroom, Judge Malcolm Voss was being led toward the side exit by 2 federal agents. His hands were not yet cuffed. That would happen outside, away from the cameras. But the way he was moving, the deliberate, careful placement of each step, made it clear he understood there was no version of this morning where he was going to walk back to his bench. He passed within 6 feet of Emily on his way out. He didn't look at her. Emily watched him go. She didn't say anything. There was nothing she needed to say. But behind her, from somewhere in the gallery, quiet, just one voice, then a second. Someone started to clap. The second person who clapped was louder than the first, and by the time Commander Dahl's team had finished securing the immediate perimeter of the courtroom, there were maybe a dozen people on their feet in the gallery, which wasn't a standing ovation and wasn't meant to be. It was just the involuntary response of people who had watched something happen that they hadn't expected to be real. Emily didn't turn around to look at them. She was watching the federal agents work. There were 4 of them moving through the courtroom now, in addition to Commander Dahl, and they operated with the particular efficiency of people who had done this enough times that the procedural steps had become muscle memory. Evidence bags. Chain of custody forms. The laptop from the hospital's legal table was tagged and removed before any of the 3 attorneys sitting behind it had fully processed that this was happening to them. One of the attorneys, a man in his 50s with silver-framed glasses, who had argued the injunction request with impressive confidence 40 minutes ago, kept starting sentences that he couldn't finish. I need to speak to... We have attorney-client. This is... Sir, one of the federal agents said, not unkindly, you'll want to call your own attorney. The man stopped talking. Commander Dahl crossed the courtroom to Emily, and up close she was even more self-contained than she'd seemed from a distance. The kind of person who had learned to take up exactly as much space as necessary and not 1 inch more. Walk with me, she said. Not a question. They moved to the anteroom off the main courtroom, a narrow space with 2 chairs and a water cooler that nobody had refilled recently. Dahl closed the door, and the noise from the gallery dropped to a muffled blur. Your contact report came in 11 days ago, Dahl said. We had corroborating intelligence from a separate channel before that. A veteran who filed a complaint with the Inspector General's office 7 months ago and got nowhere with it. Your documentation filled in the gaps we needed for federal jurisdiction. 7 months, Emily said. His complaint got buried. Someone in the IG's administrative intake process had a connection to Harwick. Dahl said it flatly, the way you said things that were infuriating but not surprising anymore. We identified that breach 4 months in. It slowed us down. Emily absorbed that. 7 months. She thought about how many patients had moved through Greyhaven's Veterans Ward in 7 months. How many incomplete discharge plans. How many billing codes for procedures that hadn't happened. How many veterans? She asked. Dahl's expression didn't change, but something around her eyes did. Current confirmed count is 214, going back approximately 3 years. Emily put her hand flat on the wall behind her, not for support, just to have something to press against. 214, she said. That number will move, Dahl said. Probably up. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Voss? Emily said. How deep? He was the legal architecture. Every time a veteran or a family member tried to file a civil claim against the hospital or Harwick, the case landed in his court. He dismissed 11 separate suits in 3 years. 2 of them had solid enough evidence that another judge would have let them proceed. Dahl paused. He also signed the order that buried the IG complaint. Administrative court order, technically legal on its face, applied to a federal intake process it had no actual jurisdiction over. Nobody caught it for 4 months. Because nobody was looking. Because nobody expected a circuit court judge to reach into a federal administrative process, Dahl said. It was brazen. Brazen enough that it worked for a while. Emily straightened up from the wall. Her shoulder ached. An old injury from her second deployment that came back whenever she was under sustained stress, which her body apparently classified as a reasonable time to remind her it existed. She ignored it. What do you need from me? She asked. Formal witness interview today if you're willing. Your documentation is already in evidence, but we need your testimony on record about the internal reporting process, specifically what Alderman said when you brought him the initial findings and the sequence of events after. He told me it was above my pay grade, Emily said. Those were his words? I know. We have the room under surveillance from the moment you walked in. That conversation's on tape. Dahl's voice didn't carry any particular satisfaction in it, just information. I'm telling you what we need from you officially because this goes to a federal grand jury and your testimony is going to matter. When? Interview today. Grand jury, we're looking at 6 to 8 weeks. Trial, longer. She looked at Emily directly. This is going to be in your life for a while. That's fine, Emily said. Dahl nodded once. She started to turn toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, she said, the contact protocol you used, most people who have access to it don't know it still functions. The program it's attached to was restructured twice in the last decade. A lot of separated personnel assume it went dark. She paused. You trusted it anyway. Someone trusted me with it, Emily said. Seemed right to return the favor. Dahl opened the door. The noise from the courtroom came back in. The formal witness interview took place in a conference room 2 floors up in the federal building across the street, and it lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Emily had expected it to be adversarial in some way. She'd been accused of enough things in the past week that her baseline assumption about official processes had shifted, but it wasn't. It was methodical and exhausting in the way that thorough things were exhausting. And when it was over, her throat was dry and her hand hurt from writing out clarifications in the margins of typed summaries. A federal paralegal brought her a cup of coffee at some point that was both terrible and the best thing she'd tasted in 3 days. She drank all of it. She was released at 4:30 in the afternoon with a contact number for the lead federal prosecutor, a case reference number, and instructions to tell no one the specific details of what she'd discussed in the interview room. She was also, for the first time in 11 days, not under threat of arrest or civil injunction or professional destruction. She stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building and called Marcus Webb. You're out, he said. I'm out. Dahl's team has everything. Grand jury in 6 to 8 weeks. Voss? Federal custody. I don't know what facility. And the hospital? Alderman's going to be arrested, probably today, based on what Dahl said about their timeline. She paused. 214 veterans, Marcus. The line was quiet for a beat. Emily, he said. Then he stopped because there wasn't really anything to say after that wasn't inadequate. You need a place to stay? Your apartment's going to have reporters outside it by tonight. She hadn't thought about that. She thought about it now. Yeah, she said. Probably. She was right. By the time she got back to her street, there were 2 news vans and a photographer on the sidewalk in front of her building, and her neighbor, Mrs. Tran, was standing in her doorway watching them with the specific expression of someone who has strong opinions about this situation but is too polite to say them out loud. Emily went in through the building's back entrance, the one that accessed the parking structure. She took the stairs. In her apartment, she packed a bag. 3 days of clothes, her laptop, the backup hard drive that held the duplicate of every file she'd submitted to the federal investigation, and she called a car to pick her up from the garage. She stayed with Marcus and his wife, Letitia, in their house on the south side of Ashridge, and that first night she ate a real meal for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, and then sat on their back porch in the cold until Letitia came out and put a blanket over her shoulders without asking. You doing okay? Letitia asked. I don't know yet, Emily said. I think I will be. That's honest, at least. Emily almost smiled. I've been practicing. The next 3 days moved in a strange kind of slow motion that was also simultaneously too fast. The story broke fully on the second day, not the version the Tribune had run, the one that had made Emily the subject, but the real version, the federal version, with Voss in custody, an alderman arrested at his home at 6 in the morning, and the lead federal prosecutor making a statement outside the federal courthouse that used phrases like systemic fraud and deliberate targeting of veteran patients in a tone that left very little room for ambiguity. Dana Ferris from the Tribune called Emily's cell phone 4 times. Emily let it ring twice, then answered the third call. I owe you an apology, Ferris said without preamble. You were fed a story, Emily said. "You ran it. That's how it works." "I should have called you for comment before." "You did call me for comment." A pause. "Right. I should have pushed harder." "Yes," Emily said. "You should have." Another pause. "Can I ask you some questions? On the record this time?" Emily thought about it. She thought about the 214 veterans and the 7 months the IG complaint had been buried, and the 11 civil suits that Voss had dismissed. She thought about the people who still didn't know what had happened to their family members' medical records, who were still trying to understand why their claims kept getting rejected, who had probably assumed by now that the system simply didn't work for them. "Send me your questions in writing first," Emily said. "I'll tell you what I can answer without compromising the federal case." "That's fair," Ferris said. She sounded relieved, which Emily understood but didn't particularly respond to. She hung up and looked at the list of other missed calls. 3 numbers she didn't recognize. A call from a blocked number. A call from a number with a Washington, D.C. area code that she stared at for a long moment before deciding to call back. The person who answered identified himself as special counsel to the Deputy Secretary of Veterans Affairs, which was a title Emily needed a moment to process. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "my name is Reginald Ashworth. I'm calling on behalf of the Secretary's office to let you know that we are fully aware of the situation at Greyhaven and the broader Harwick contract, and that a comprehensive audit of the 3 other facilities under that contract has been initiated as of this morning." Emily sat down. "All 3, she said. "We have reason to believe the methodology wasn't unique to Ashridge." His voice was careful in the way of someone who had been very well trained in what not to say. "I can't give you specifics on an active audit. I'm calling to inform you that your documentation has been formally entered into the Secretary's review, and that you will be contacted by our oversight office within the week." "How many veterans total?" Emily asked. "Across all 4 facilities." There was a pause that lasted a beat too long. "Ms. Brooks," Ashworth said, "I'm not in a position to share projected numbers at this stage." She knew what that meant. She'd been in enough briefings where someone chose their words that carefully to know that it meant the number was large enough that saying it out loud, officially, to someone who had any connection to the press was something the Secretary's office had explicitly told him not to do. She thanked him and ended the call. She sat for a while. Marcus found her in the kitchen an hour later and set a glass of water in front of her without being asked, which meant she'd been sitting there long enough that it was noticeable. 3 other facilities, she said. He sat down across from her. He'd been in the Army long enough to know when to wait. "Same contractor," she said. "Same methodology. Harwick's been running this at 4 hospitals, Marcus. I found 214. The VA is auditing the other 3. They wouldn't tell me the projected number." She paused. "The fact that they wouldn't tell me means it's not a small number." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What do you need to do?" "Right now? Nothing. The federal case is moving. The VA is auditing. My testimony's on record." She picked up the glass and took a drink. "But I need to go back in front of a camera, and I need to say something useful because 214 veterans in Ashridge had their health care systematically stolen, and none of them know yet that someone's actually done something about it." The federal prosecutor's press conference said systemic fraud and deliberate targeting, but didn't name a single veteran, didn't describe what actually happened to them medically, didn't explain what they're entitled to now. She set the glass down. Those people deserved to hear it in plain language from someone who was on the ward. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He'd known her for 8 years, since a forward operating base in a country where the humidity made everything feel like wearing a wet sweater, and he'd watched her make decisions in situations that had exactly no good options. He knew her tells. He knew when she'd already decided something and was saying it out loud to confirm it rather than to ask. "You're going to talk to Ferris," he said. "I'm going to talk to Ferris," Emily said. She drafted her answers to Dana Ferris's written questions that evening, carefully, going over each response twice before sending it. She talked about what she'd seen on the ward. She talked about the discharge patterns, the billing discrepancies, what it actually meant for a veteran to be discharged before their care was complete. She talked about what happened when she reported it internally. She did not talk about anything specific to the federal investigation. The article ran the following morning, and it was different in every way from the one Ferris had published before. It had the veterans ward in the headline. It had language that actually explained what the fraud had done to real people. It had a quote from Emily that Ferris had reproduced exactly as written. These were patients who served this country under conditions most people will never understand. What happened to them wasn't a paperwork error. It was a choice. Someone chose to steal from them because they assumed no one was watching. By 8 in the morning, that quote had been shared 40,000 times. By noon, 3 of the veterans whose cases Emily had originally flagged had been contacted by the VA's oversight office and told their files were under review. By 3 in the afternoon, one of them, a man named Gerald Pruitt, 64 years old, Army infantry veteran, 2 hip replacements that hadn't been properly followed up on, had his daughter call Emily's phone directly. Emily didn't know how she'd gotten the number. She answered anyway. "I just wanted to say thank you," the daughter said. Her voice was doing the thing voices did when someone had been crying recently but was trying to sound composed. "My dad has been trying to get answers for a year. They kept telling him his file was under review. They kept sending him to a phone number that didn't work." "It's going to be fixed," Emily said. "The VA's audit is real. Make sure he responds to any contact from the oversight office." "He will. He absolutely will." A pause. "The article said you were a combat nurse, that you served." "Yes," Emily said. "Then you understand why. You know why he never complained, why he just kept accepting it." Emily did know. She'd watched men and women in uniform absorb things that would have broken someone who hadn't been trained to keep moving under pressure, and then carry that same reflex into civilian life where it worked against them, where the instinct to not make a fuss, to not demand more than what was offered, meant that people who should have been fighting for them could simply not fight and get away with it. "He's not alone," Emily said. "Not anymore." She ended the call, sat with it for a minute, then opened her laptop because there was more work to do and the afternoon wasn't getting any longer. What she didn't see, because she was looking at her laptop and not at the window, was the black sedan that had been parked across the street from Marcus's house since morning. The same sedan that had been parked outside the federal building when she'd exited the day before. The same plates, the same tinted windows, facing the same direction. It was still there when the streetlights came on, and when Emily finally looked up and noticed it at 9 p.m., it was gone. But not before she'd photographed it through the curtain with her phone, and not before she'd noticed that it hadn't moved in 8 hours. She forwarded the photo to Commander Dahl's number without a message. 3 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Noted. Don't go anywhere alone tonight. Emily stared at that message for a long time. Someone in this network was still outside a federal cell, and whoever it was had figured out exactly where she was staying. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't new. She hadn't slept well in years, not since the second deployment, not since the mass casualty event that had lasted 19 hours and left her with a specific relationship to darkness and silence that she'd never fully resolved. But that night was worse than usual, because her mind kept returning to the sedan and what it meant that someone outside the federal case knew where she was. Dahl's message had been 3 words and a period. Don't go anywhere alone tonight. Not, we're sending someone. Not, you're protected. Just, don't go alone. Which meant the threat was real enough to name but not contained enough to neutralize. Emily lay on Marcus and Letitia's guest bed and stared at the ceiling and ran through the list of who was still unaccounted for. Voss was in federal custody. Alderman had been arrested. The Harwick compliance woman, whose name Emily had since learned was Sonia Kraft, Harwick's VP of Contract Management, had been taken in for questioning the morning after the courtroom. But Harwick itself was a company, and companies had layers, and the $12 million annual contract that had funded 3 years of systematic fraud didn't run itself. There was a money chain. There was someone above Kraft. There was someone who had made the decision to structure the billing fraud across 4 facilities simultaneously, which required coordination at a level that didn't happen without executive sign-off. Someone in that chain was still outside a federal building, and that person had found her in 36 hours. She got up at 5:30 and made coffee in Marcus's kitchen without turning the overhead light on, standing at the window in the gray pre-dawn and watching the street. The sedan wasn't back. That didn't make her feel better. A surveillance vehicle that had been made would either disappear or be replaced with something less obvious, and she didn't know which had happened. Marcus came down at 6:15 and found her there. He didn't say anything about the hour or the dark kitchen. He just poured himself a cup and stood beside her at the window. "You think it's Harwick Corporate?" he said. "Has to be. Voss didn't have the resources to run surveillance independently, and Alderman was too small for this kind of response." She drank her coffee. Kraft was VP of Contract Management. That's operational. The person above her is strategic. They designed the structure. They have the most to lose if the VA audit spreads to the other 3 facilities. "What's Dahl doing?" "I don't know. She said noted. She hasn't called." Marcus thought about that. "She's not going to tell you her operational steps." "I know." Emily paused. "I need to know who Harwick's CEO is." "You can Google that." "I did. Harwick's CEO on public record is a man named Burton Lyle. But Harwick was acquired 18 months ago by a holding company called Meridian Group, and Meridian's ownership structure is buried in 3 layers of incorporation in Delaware. I got as far as a name on the original Meridian filing, Thomas Greer, and then the trail goes into private equity, and I don't have the tools to follow it from there." Marcus set his cup down. "I know someone." "From the Army." "From after. She does financial forensics for a law firm, corporate structure, beneficial ownership, the stuff that private equity buries." He looked at Emily. "She's good, and she owes me a favor I've been sitting on for 2 years. Emily looked at him. "Call her." The contact's name was Nora Vasquez, and she called back within 40 minutes of Marcus reaching out, which suggested the favor she owed him was significant. Emily explained what she needed without explaining why, and Vasquez said she'd need 4 hours and a case number she could run against the federal court system to confirm this was legitimate, and Emily gave her Commander Dahl's case reference number and told her to call the federal prosecutor's office to verify it. Vasquez called back in 3 hours and 20 minutes. Meridian Group's beneficial owner of record, traced through the Delaware holding structure and 2 Cayman-registered subsidiaries, is a man named Douglas Farrell, she said. "He's not on any public Harwick documentation. He's listed as a passive investor in Meridian. But the Cayman structure gives him controlling interest in Meridian's voting shares, which means he controls Harwick's board." "Douglas Farrell," Emily said. "Do you have anything on him beyond the corporate structure?" "He's 61, retired from the Army in 2009 at the rank of Brigadier General. After retirement, he founded 2 private defense consulting firms before Meridian, both dissolved. He has a home in Ashridge and a second property in Scottsdale." A pause. "Emily, a retired general with controlling interest in a company defrauding the VA out of veteran healthcare funds. You understand what this is?" "I understand what it is," Emily said. "This needs to go to Dahl today." "It's going to Dahl right now." She was already pulling up the contact. "Thank you, Nora." She sent the name and corporate structure summary to Commander Dahl by encrypted message at 9:47 in the morning. Dahl's response came back in 11 minutes, which was fast enough to tell Emily that Farrell was not a new name to the investigation, but that what Emily had sent had provided something the federal team hadn't yet confirmed. "This corroborates. We've been building toward him. Don't discuss this with anyone. Stay put. Stay put." Emily read that twice. She understood the operational logic, keeping a federal witness contained in predictable reduced risk. She also understood that staying put in a location that a surveillance vehicle had already identified was its own kind of risk, and that Dahl's team was making a calculation about which threat was larger. She stayed put. She worked. She spent the morning writing out a detailed timeline of everything she'd observed on Greyhaven's Veterans Ward, everything Alderman had said, every administrative override she'd flagged, in a format that was organized for legal use rather than personal record. She'd already done this once for the witness interview, but doing it again with the additional context she now had about the scope of the fraud meant she caught details she'd compressed the first time. Small things. The name of a billing coordinator who had processed several of the irregular discharge orders, and who Emily had noticed always left the floor immediately afterward. The fact that the specialist referrals in the falsified records all used the same phone exchange, different from the hospital's main switchboard, that rang to a number she'd never been able to reach when she'd tested it. She added those to the document and sent it to the federal prosecutor's office at 11 a.m. At 12:30, Marcus's phone rang. He stepped outside to take the call, and Emily watched through the window as his posture shifted. the slight tightening that meant the call was something serious. He was on for 4 minutes. When he came back inside, he had the expression of someone assembling how to say something. "That was a contact at Ashridge PD," he said. "Someone filed a complaint this morning with the state medical board against you." Emily looked at him. "Alleging that you disclosed protected patient information to federal investigators without proper consent authorization," Marcus said. "The complaint was filed by a private attorney. The attorney's firm has represented Harwick in state-level contract disputes twice in the past 4 years." "They're trying to get my nursing license," Emily said. "It won't work. The federal case will supersede." "It doesn't have to work," Emily said. "It just has to create enough noise to make my testimony look compromised before the grand jury." She stood up. "Whose name is on the complaint?" "The attorney's name is Patrick Sorum. The filing references an unnamed Greyhaven staff member as the source of the complaint." Emily thought about the charge nurse who had told her she'd look into the incident report and then done nothing. She thought about the billing coordinator who always left the floor too quickly. She thought about the fact that in every operation she'd ever been part of, when the primary approach failed, there was always a secondary, and the secondary was usually aimed at the weakest structural point. Her credibility was the weakest structural point now. That was what the complaint was for. She called the federal prosecutor's office and reached an assistant who took her information and told her someone would call back. Someone called back in 20 minutes. A woman named AUSA Diane Collier, who was sharper on the phone than anyone Emily had spoken to in 3 days. "We're aware of the complaint," Collier said. "We've already flagged Sorum's firm's connection to Harwick. The state medical board has been notified that you are a federally protected witness in an active case, and they're legally constrained in how they can proceed. This is a pressure tactic, Ms. Brooks, not a legitimate proceeding." "I know what it is," Emily said. "I'm telling you because I want it on record that it happened." "It's on record. Are you somewhere safe?" The question landed differently than it might have 2 days ago. "For now," Emily said. At 2 in the afternoon, Commander Dahl called her directly. Not by message, by voice, which Emily had not expected and which immediately told her something had moved. "We have a location on Farrell," Dahl said. "He hasn't left Ashridge. We believe he's attempting to coordinate document destruction at the Harwick Regional Office, which is located here in the city. We're executing a search warrant within the hour." The surveillance on this house was Farrell's private security contractor, not law enforcement. "We've identified the firm. They've been warned off. If you see the vehicle again, call me directly." A pause. "Emily, the search warrant is going to generate press. Your name will come up again. I want you to be prepared for that." "I'm prepared," Emily said. She wasn't entirely. You could be intellectually prepared for something and still feel the specific weight of it when it happened. The way a name in a headline changed the texture of a day, the way strangers formed opinions about you based on 4 sentences and a photograph. She'd been through 1 round of it already, and she knew it didn't feel the way people imagined it would. It didn't feel like being seen. It felt like being reduced. But she'd dealt with reduction before. She'd been reduced in that courtroom, and she'd stood still, and she'd been right to. The search of Harwick's Ashridge Regional Office began at 3:15. Emily knew this because Marcus had the news on, and the first footage, a camera at a distance, Dahl's team moving through the building entrance, appeared on a local channel at 3:40. By 4, it was on the national wire. By 4:30, it was something else entirely. One of the federal agents inside the Harwick building had found a server room that wasn't on the building's official floor plan. Behind a wall panel in what was registered as a storage room, accessible only through a keypad whose code was not in any building management documentation, there was a rack of servers that had been running continuously and that, when the federal tech team began accessing them, contained encrypted records going back 4.5 years. Emily found out about this not from Dahl, who was inside the building and unreachable, but from AUSA Collier, who called at 5:20 with a voice that was professionally steady, and underneath it something that took Emily a moment to identify as controlled disbelief. The server records include billing documentation, internal communications, and what appear to be authorization chains for the discharge manipulation protocol across all 4 facilities, Collier said. They also include communications between Farrell and Voss going back to the beginning of the scheme, and between Farrell and at least 2 individuals inside the VA's administrative structure. Emily sat down. Inside the VA, she said. We're not releasing that publicly yet. But yes, the complaint that was buried 7 months ago, we now have internal VA communications authorizing the burial. Someone in the administrative intake process didn't just have a connection to Harwick. They were being paid. The scope of it kept expanding. Every time Emily thought she'd understood the shape of what had happened, there was another layer underneath. Another person who had made a choice. Another system that had been bent to a purpose it wasn't designed for. Another veteran who had received less than they were owed because someone had calculated that veterans were a population unlikely to push back hard enough to create consequences. How many people total? Emily asked. In terms of the conspiracy? We're currently looking at 14 individuals across Harwick, the judiciary, and the VA administrative structure. That number will likely increase. Collier paused. Douglas Farrell was taken into federal custody 45 minutes ago. I'm telling you this before it becomes public because you deserve to know before you see it on television. Emily was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. She told Marcus after the call. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, and they were both quiet for a while, in the way of people who have been operating under sustained pressure and have just received news that shifts something fundamental but doesn't immediately feel like relief, because relief requires a kind of stillness that hadn't arrived yet. 14 people, Marcus said. Minimum. Letitia came in from the back of the house and looked at both of them and said, What happened? They got the person at the top, Marcus said. Letitia sat down. She looked at Emily. You okay? I'm going to need a minute to figure that out, Emily said. She went out to the back porch. It was cold, properly cold now, the November dark coming in fast. She'd left her jacket inside and she didn't go back for it. She stood at the railing and looked at the strip of sky above the neighbor's roof and thought about the 7 veterans she'd originally flagged. She thought about Gerald Pruitt, 64 years old, waiting a year for someone to answer his questions. She thought about 214 confirmed cases and a number above that which Reginald Ashworth had refused to say out loud. She thought about the fact that she had sent one encrypted message from her kitchen in the dark and trusted it would go somewhere because that was all she'd had. That and 3 weeks of documentation and 6 years of military medical training that had taught her the difference between a systemic failure and a deliberate choice. She'd been cold before. She'd been cold in places where the temperature was the least of her problems, in field conditions where comfort was a theoretical concept you mentally filed away for later. She didn't go back inside for a long time. When she did, Marcus was on his laptop and Letitia had made something that smelled like actual food, and the news was running the Harwick server story with a graphic that showed the 4 hospital locations and the phrase alleged multi-site veteran healthcare fraud in a lower third chyron. Emily watched the coverage for about 10 minutes. Then she turned away from the television because there was something she needed to do that the news cycle was going to make harder if she waited. She needed to call Gerald Pruitt's daughter. She found the number in her recent calls and dialed. It rang 5 times. She was about to hang up when it connected. Miss Brooks? The daughter's voice was cautious. She hadn't expected the call. Yes. I wanted you to hear this from me directly before it's everywhere tonight. The federal investigation has made significant arrests, including the person at the top of the organization that ran the fraud. Your father's case and all the others will be part of the grand jury proceedings. The VA audit is going to result in compensation review for every affected veteran. There was a silence on the line, then a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not. He's been trying for so long, the daughter said finally. He never told me how bad it was. I found out when I started going to appointments with him. He kept saying it wasn't worth making a fuss. I know, Emily said. He's 74, Ms. Brooks. He doesn't have, how long is this going to take? The grand jury, the trial? I can't promise you a timeline, Emily said. I won't do that. But the VA's compensation review for documented cases can happen faster than the criminal trial, and I'm going to push for that process to be front-loaded. I don't have authority over it, but I have a direct contact now, and I intend to use it. She paused. Tell your father his name is in the federal record. He's documented. He's not invisible. Another silence. Longer. Thank you, the daughter said. I don't know how else to say it. Just thank you. Emily stayed on the phone another few minutes, giving her the federal oversight number and the VA audit contact Ashworth had provided. When she hung up, her hand was steadier than it had been in days. Marcus looked at her from the couch. You just spent 40 minutes on a back porch in November and then called a stranger to reassure her, he said. You're aware that you are also a person who has been through a significant amount in the last 2 weeks. I'm aware, Emily said. Letitia made soup. I'll have soup. She had the soup. She answered 2 more calls, one from the federal prosecutor's office with procedural updates, one from an unknown number that turned out to be a veteran in Portland who had somehow gotten her number through the Tribune article and who wanted to know if what was happening in Ashridge could help his case at a Harwick-affiliated facility in his city. She took his information. She told him to contact the VA oversight line. She told him it was going to matter. She fell asleep on the couch at 10:30 with the news still on, and Marcus turned it off sometime after midnight, and she didn't wake up until the phone rang at 4:17 in the morning and Dahl's name was on the screen. Emily answered before the second ring. We have a problem, Dahl said. Her voice was the flat, controlled kind that meant the problem was already in motion. 3 of the 14 individuals we identified have attorney-client privilege claims that are going to delay their formal charges. One of them is an administrative judge in the state appellate system who filed an emergency injunction 2 hours ago seeking to suppress the server evidence on the grounds that it was obtained without proper notification of his participation in a legally privileged communication. Emily was sitting up now, fully awake. He's claiming attorney-client privilege on communications about committing fraud? The claim won't hold, but it doesn't need to hold. It needs to buy 48 hours, which is apparently enough time for his defense team to file a parallel motion in federal court seeking to exclude the server communications from the grand jury record. Dahl paused. If the motion succeeds, and it won't, but if it does, it breaks the authorization chain we need to tie Farrell directly to the VA insiders. Without that chain, Farrell's attorneys can argue he had no knowledge of the VA side payments, and the conspiracy charge drops to a lower count. Emily understood the implication. The authorization chain was the architecture of the whole case. It was what turned 14 people connected by individual charges into a single coordinated conspiracy. Break the chain, and you had a collection of individuals with plausible deniability instead of a network. What can I do? She asked. Your timeline documentation, Dahl said. The detailed one you sent the prosecutor's office this morning. There are 2 entries in it. The billing coordinator who processed the irregular discharge orders and the phone exchange on the specialist referrals that rang to a dead number. We need you to come in this morning and testify to those observations under oath before the emergency injunction hearing. Your first-hand testimony establishes independent corroboration of the authorization chain that doesn't depend on the server evidence. Emily was already moving to find her shoes. What time? She said. 6 a.m. Federal Building. I'm sending a car. I'll be ready. She ended the call. Marcus was in the doorway of the hallway. He slept lightly, always had, which was an army thing that didn't go away, and he looked at her in the way that meant he'd heard enough. I have to go in at 6, she said. I'll drive you. Dahl's sending... I'll follow the car, he said. Don't argue with me at 4 in the morning, Emily. She didn't argue. The Federal Building at 6 a.m. was the particular quiet of an institution that had been operating without stopping and would continue to do so regardless of the hour. The lights were all on. People moved through the hallways with the focused economy of people whose work had developed a new urgency in the past 18 hours. Emily was brought to a conference room where AUSA Collier was already present, along with a court reporter and a federal judge she didn't recognize. Older, small, with the manner of someone who had been called in at an unacceptable hour and had decided to conduct the proceedings with absolute precision as a form of protest against the inconvenience. The testimony took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Emily described everything she'd observed in sequence with dates and times where she had them, in the flat, careful language she'd trained herself to use when the stakes of being misunderstood were too high to risk any ambiguity. The billing coordinator's name was Judith Reyes, and Emily described the pattern of her movements on the ward. Present for the irregular discharge orders, absent from the floor within 10 minutes of each processing, which was not in itself conclusive, but was a pattern Emily had noticed and documented in her personal notes because patterns were what you documented when you couldn't yet explain them. The phone exchange she'd tested twice, on different days, from different hospital phones. Rang 6 times each. No voicemail. No recorded message. The exchange prefix matched a block assigned to a Harwick-affiliated communications vendor, which she hadn't known at the time, but which the federal tech team had since confirmed. When it was over, the judge looked at her for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite readable. "You maintain personal documentation of these observations while employed at Greyhaven?" he said. "Yes, Your Honor." "In what format?" "Handwritten notes in a personal notebook, dated daily, transferred to a digital file on a personal device not connected to hospital systems." "Why?" Emily considered the question, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give the right version of it, the one that was true rather than the one that sounded good. "Because I was trained to document what I couldn't explain yet," she said, "and because I've learned that when institutions fail people, what protects the people eventually is the record." The judge looked at her for another moment. Then he made a note. The emergency injunction hearing happened at 9 a.m. Emily was not present in the room, but Collier gave her a summary by phone at 10:30. The injunction had been denied. The server evidence remained in the federal record. The authorization chain was intact. Emily was sitting in a waiting area on the 4th floor of the federal building when she got that call, and she let out a breath that she'd been holding since 4 in the morning. Her shoulder ached. Her eyes felt like sandpaper. She hadn't eaten since the soup the night before, and she was now aware of that in the specific way of someone whose body has been running on stress responses for too long and is beginning to present invoices. She found a vending machine. She bought crackers and a bottle of water and ate standing up in the hallway because there was nowhere to sit nearby, and she didn't want to walk all the way back to the waiting area. She was standing there, crackers in one hand, phone in the other, fluorescent lights doing what fluorescent lights did, which was make everything look slightly worse than it was, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the elevator bank. Then she heard a specific sound that she recognized before she consciously processed it. The controlled commotion of federal agents responding to something unexpected. The shuffle in command voices that meant something had happened that wasn't on the schedule. She moved toward the sound before she'd made a decision to move. Training. Her feet were already going before her brain finished the argument about whether it was her business. It was an elevator. The doors were open. Inside, slumped against the back wall, was a man in a suit, mid-50s, no jacket, his shirt collar open, his face the gray-white of someone in serious cardiac distress. 2 federal agents were already moving toward him. One of them had a phone to his ear. The other was looking at the man with the particular paralysis of someone who knew they needed to do something but didn't know what. "Move," Emily said. She was inside the elevator before the agent processed the word. She checked pulse. Present, irregular, fast and weak. Skin cold and clammy. The man's breathing was shallow, and she could see the visible effort of it, the muscles in his neck working. She recognized the presentation. She'd seen it in the field, in older soldiers under extreme stress, in the controlled crisis conditions that turned a bad situation into a medical emergency. "He's in acute cardiac distress," she said to the agent on the phone. "Tell them PEA is possible. He needs an AED and an IV now." "She's a nurse," someone said behind her, which wasn't helpful but wasn't wrong. The man on the elevator floor opened his eyes and looked at her. He was having trouble staying focused. His lips were moving. She put her hand on his sternum, not pressing, just presence, the way she'd been trained to make physical contact with patients who were frightened and losing orientation. "You're going to be okay," she said, because it was what the situation required, even when you couldn't verify it. "Stay with me. Help is coming." The man's hand moved. He grabbed her wrist, not with force, with the particular grip of someone trying to anchor themselves. And then she looked at his face properly, in the harsh fluorescent light of a federal building elevator, and she recognized him. It was Thomas Greer, the name on the original Meridian Group filing, the man 1 layer below Douglas Farrell in the corporate structure Nora Vasquez had traced. A federal agent arrived with an AED, another with a first aid kit. Emily took the AED without breaking her focus on Greer's breathing, because this was her territory and she was not going to step back from it. But Greer's hand was still on her wrist. His lips were still moving. She leaned closer because the hallway noise was making it hard to hear, and what he said, what he managed to get out in the 12 seconds before the AED powered up and the situation became fully medical, was not what she expected. "There's another server," he said. "Not in Ashridge." "There's another server," he said. "Not in Ashridge." Those words stayed in Emily's head like a frequency she couldn't tune out, even as the AED powered up and the situation collapsed entirely into the clinical, shock advisory, clear, the specific smell of a federal building hallway at 6 in the morning mixed with the particular urgency of a body in distress. She worked without thinking about what she was doing because that was how you worked when the thinking part of your brain needed to be somewhere else. She did what the situation required. She kept Thomas Greer alive, and she kept him conscious for the 90 seconds it took the paramedics to arrive, and she stepped back the moment she could hand it off, because she knew the boundary between her role and theirs, and she'd always been precise about that line. The paramedics took over. Greer went on to the gurney. His hand released her wrist. She stood in the hallway and watched them wheel him toward the freight elevator, and then she turned and found Commander Dahl standing 4 feet behind her with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who had just heard something significant and was managing their response to it. "You heard that," Emily said. It wasn't a question. "I heard it," Dahl said. "He said not in Ashridge." "I heard what he said." Dahl's voice was level. "Come with me." They moved to a conference room, not the one Emily had testified in, a different one, smaller, with a window that looked onto an interior courtyard where nobody was. Dahl closed the door. She stood at the table rather than sitting, which Emily had come to understand was how Dahl operated when she was thinking fast. Greer's role in the structure, Dahl said, was financial oversight. He didn't run operations. He ran the money, the movement of funds between Harwick's contract receivables, the Meridian holding structure, and Farrell's personal financial instruments. If there's a second server, it's not a backup of the Ashridge data. It's the financial layer, the transaction records that show where the money actually went. Emily sat down. "How much money are we talking about?" "Across 4 facilities, 3 years, federal contract billing, plus the veteran benefit diversions?" Dahl paused. "Conservative estimate is 40 to 60 million. The Ashridge server gives us the operational evidence, the discharge manipulation, the falsified records, the communication chains. But it doesn't fully show us the financial architecture. If there's a second server with transaction records, that's the difference between a conspiracy conviction with a sentencing range in the 10 to 15-year territory and one that puts people away for significantly longer." "And Greer told me about it," Emily said. Dahl looked at her. "He told you, in a hallway with federal agents present while experiencing a cardiac event, which means his attorneys are going to argue he was not in a competent state to make disclosures, and anything he said was, 'He grabbed my wrist,'" Emily said. "He waited until I was close enough to hear, and then he said it. He knew exactly what he was doing. I know that. His lawyers won't care. So I'm a witness to something that can't be officially sourced to him, unless he confirms it when he's medically stable and chooses to cooperate." Dahl sat down now. "Which is possible. He's not the architect of this. He's the accountant. And accountants, when they're looking at federal fraud charges carrying 30 years, sometimes decide that cooperation has a better return than loyalty. How long before he's medically stable? They'll assess him at the hospital. Cardiac events like this, depending on the cause, you're looking at 24 to 72 hours before he can have a formal conversation." Emily thought about the 48-hour window the appellate judge's motion had been designed to create. She thought about document destruction and the timeline pressures that drove people to desperate moves. She thought about Thomas Greer, who had grabbed her wrist in a federal building elevator and told her something he didn't have to tell her, and what that meant about where he thought this was going. "He's cooperating," Emily said. "He already made that decision before the cardiac event. That's why he's in this building. He came in." Dahl was quiet for a moment. "He came in voluntarily at 5:40 this morning. We hadn't arrested him yet. His attorney made contact with the prosecutor's office at midnight and said Greer wanted to talk. She paused. The cardiac event happened before the interview could start. Where's the second server? We don't know. What he told you is literally all we have. Emily sat with that. Not in Ashridge. A financial server containing $40 to $60 million in transaction records, held somewhere outside the jurisdiction where the investigation had been running, maintained by a man who had walked into a federal building voluntarily at 5:40 in the morning because he'd decided the walls were close enough that the only smart play was to get ahead of them. When his attorneys come, Emily said, and when he's stable enough to talk, he's going to tell you where it is. He came in voluntarily. He told me about it. He's not protecting Farrell. He's protecting himself. The server location is his bargaining chip. That's my read as well, Dahl said, which means the next 24 to 72 hours are the most critical point of this entire investigation. We have Farrell in custody, but without the financial layer, his attorneys can limit his exposure significantly. If Greer gives us the server, and it contains what I think it contains, the entire case changes shape. Emily looked at the window and the empty courtyard. She thought about what Collier had said the night before. The authorization chain, the VA insiders, the structure of it. She thought about how many times she'd been in situations where the thing that mattered most was the thing you couldn't fully control, and all you could do was make sure everything in your own scope was clean and solid and documented. Tell me what you need from me, she said. Right now, go eat something, Dahl said. You look like you've been running on coffee and adrenaline for 3 days. 4 days, Emily said. Go eat. I'll call you when Greer is stable. She found Marcus in the lobby because, of course, Marcus had waited. He took one look at her and didn't ask questions, which she appreciated. They went to a diner 2 blocks from the federal building, and she ate eggs and toast and drank 2 cups of coffee that were better than the institutional kind. And Marcus sat across from her and ate a large breakfast with the quiet patience of someone who knew when to let a situation breathe. You want to tell me what happened up there? He said when she was most of the way through her food. She told him. She kept it brief. The elevator, Greer, what he'd said, what Dahl thought it meant. Marcus listened without interrupting. He came in voluntarily, Marcus said when she finished. Yes. Then it's already over for Farrell. He just doesn't know it yet. He drank his coffee. Accountants always know where the exits are. That's the job. When the building starts burning, they leave first. Emily almost smiled. It felt strange on her face, which told her she hadn't done it in a while. That's a very Marcus way to put it. It's accurate. She sat back. Outside the diner window, Ashridge was doing what mid-sized cities did on November mornings. Moving with purpose and without particular drama, people going to work, a delivery truck blocking half a lane while the driver ignored everyone's frustration, a woman walking a dog that was clearly making the directional decisions. Regular. Ordinary. The kind of morning that had no awareness of federal investigations or veterans whose medical records had been falsified or retired generals sitting in federal custody 2 blocks away. Emily had spent a lot of years moving through ordinary mornings while carrying things the morning didn't know about. She was used to the gap between what was visible and what was actually happening. It just felt different when the thing that was actually happening was also, for the first time in a long time, moving in the right direction. The call from Dahl came at 2:17 that afternoon. Greer had stabilized. It wasn't a heart attack. Hypertensive crisis brought on by acute stress, which the ER physician had treated and which carried a better short-term prognosis than a cardiac event proper, though it was a clear signal that Greer's body was communicating something he'd probably been ignoring. He'd been cleared for a limited interview. His attorney was present. He was, per Dahl's phrasing, inclined to be helpful. The second server was in a data center in Columbus, Ohio. Emily found this out from AUSA Collier at 4 p.m. in a call that was brief and carefully worded, and the specific words Collier used were significant financial documentation and cooperative disclosure, and this changes the sentencing calculation substantially for all parties, which Emily translated without difficulty. Greer had given them what they needed, and what they needed was enough to dismantle the financial architecture of the entire scheme in a way that left Douglas Farrell with very few places to stand legally. The Columbus data center was accessed by federal agents under a warrant signed at 3:45. The server was intact, no evidence of attempted deletion, which meant Greer had been the only person who knew its exact location, and he hadn't tipped off Farrell before coming in. And Farrell's team had therefore been trying to destroy the wrong data. Collier said, Mr. Farrell's attorneys contacted the prosecutor's office at 3 p.m. to indicate their client might be open to discussing cooperation terms. Emily said, What did the prosecutor's office say? Collier said, We said Mr. Farrell should have considered that option before we found the Columbus server. Emily hung up and sat in Marcus's living room for a moment, in the particular quiet of a situation that has just shifted irrevocably. She could hear Letitia in the kitchen. The television was off for once. Outside, it had started to rain. She didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't what it felt like. It felt like something heavy had been set down. Not released, not over, but set down after you'd been carrying it far enough that the physical memory of the weight didn't go away just because your hands were empty. The next 72 hours moved in the particular rhythm of a federal investigation that has found its footing and is no longer scrambling, purposeful, procedural, loud in the press, and quiet in the rooms where it actually mattered. The Columbus server contained 4.5 years of transaction records covering $53 million in fraudulent billing proceeds, a shadow payroll that had been used to compensate the VA administrative insiders, and a set of encrypted communications between Farrell and Voss that predated the Harwick acquisition by 2 years, which meant the fraud had been designed before Harwick was even the vehicle for it. Farrell had bought the company specifically to run it. That detail, 2 years of planning before the first falsified discharge record, appeared in the federal prosecutor's public statement and hit the news at 7 p.m. on a Thursday, and the coverage was different from everything that had come before it. Not the careful language of alleged and alleged to have and sources indicate, but the specific directness of a story that had enough documented evidence behind it that the hedging language had become unnecessary. Emily watched the coverage from Marcus's couch and thought about what it meant that someone had spent 2 years designing a system to steal from veterans, and what that said about what they believed about veterans, about whether veterans would notice, whether they'd fight back, whether the system that was supposed to protect them would actually function on their behalf. They had believed it wouldn't. They had been wrong. She went to bed at 10 and slept better than she had in 2 weeks, which wasn't saying much, but it was something. The next morning brought 2 things she hadn't expected. The first was a call from Reginald Ashworth at the VA Secretary's office, this time with actual numbers. The audit of the 3 other Harwick facilities had produced a preliminary count of 841 affected veterans across all 4 sites. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table when he told her, and she wrote the number down in the margin of a notebook, because she needed to see it in her own handwriting to make it real. 841. The Secretary is committed to expedited compensation review for every documented case, Ashworth said. We're standing up a dedicated task force. The timeline for initial compensation decisions is 30 days from formal case documentation. 30 days, Emily said. For all 841? That's the commitment, yes. I won't tell you the internal pressure it took to get to that number. He paused. I'll also tell you that your name has been mentioned at the Secretary's level in the context of the response effort. There are conversations happening about your role going forward. I can't give you specifics yet, but you should expect to be contacted in the next week. Emily noted that without responding to it directly, because she wasn't going to get ahead of a conversation that hadn't happened yet. She thanked him and hung up. The second unexpected thing arrived at 11 a.m. in the form of Patrick Sorum, the attorney who had filed the state medical board complaint on Harwick's behalf, calling her cell phone directly. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Ms. Brooks, Sorum said. He sounded like a man who had spent the night revising his position on several things. I'm calling to inform you that the complaint filed with the state medical board on the 14th has been formally withdrawn. I'm aware that it had no merit, Emily said. Yes. Well, a pause. The firm has also terminated its representation of Harwick Defense Medical Solutions, effective as of this morning. That's your business, Emily said. I wanted to inform you directly rather than, Mr. Sorum, Emily said, I don't need your phone call. If you feel like you did something wrong, that's between you and whoever you answer to, but I have work to do. She hung up. Marcus, who had heard exactly half of that conversation from across the room, looked at her with the particular expression of someone who is both impressed and slightly concerned. "You hung up on an attorney," he said. "He withdrew the complaint," Emily said. "He got what he was going to get from me, which was the information that I knew it had no merit. The rest of his processing is his to do." She went back to her laptop. There was a detailed written statement the federal prosecutor's office had asked her to prepare regarding the billing coordinator Judith Reyes, whose involvement had been corroborated by the Columbus server. Specifically, a series of payments to a personal account held in Reyes' name through one of the shadow payroll structures. Reyes had been questioned and, according to Collier, had provided information about a third-tier administrator at Greyhaven named Winston Holt, who had served as the on-site coordinator between the hospital's administrative structure and Harwick's contract management team. Holt had attempted to leave the country on the morning of the Columbus server disclosure and had been detained at the airport. He was now in federal custody. His arrest brought the total to 16 individuals. Emily wrote the statement on Reyes. She was precise and factual and kept her language as close to observational record as possible, because the value of her testimony was in its specificity, not its editorializing. She submitted it at 1:30 and then spent the afternoon doing something she hadn't done in 2 weeks. She went for a run. Not because it cleared her head. That was a thing people said about exercise that had never quite been true for her. She ran because her body had been static and stressed for too long, and it needed to move through something physical rather than just sitting with the accumulated weight of the past 14 days. She ran 4 miles in the cold November air, badly. Her lungs weren't happy. Her left knee did what it always did on pavement in cold weather, which was remind her of a badly handled jump from a vehicle in a location she still wasn't cleared to name. And she came back to Marcus's house damp and tired and marginally better than she'd been before. She was in the shower when her phone buzzed on the bathroom shelf. She didn't look at it until she was out and dressed, and by then there were 2 texts and a missed call, all from the same number. Dolls. She called back immediately. "The grand jury has been formally convened," Dahl said when she answered. "We've moved the timeline up. The original 6 to 8 week estimate is now 3 weeks, based on the volume of evidence and the number of defendants who are cooperating." 3 weeks, Emily said. Greer is fully cooperative. The VA insiders, there are 2 of them, both mid-level administrative managers in the intake processing division, both entered cooperation agreements this morning. Voss's former clerk, who processed the improper administrative court orders, is also cooperating. The picture that's coming together for the grand jury is complete in a way that makes this almost... Dahl paused, which was unusual for her. "It's clean, is what I'm saying. The evidence chain is clean." Emily sat on the edge of the bed. "What about Farrell?" "Farrell's attorneys have made 3 separate overtures about cooperation terms. We've declined all of them. He's the architect. He's not getting a cooperation deal." "What is he facing?" "The full charge count, which currently stands at conspiracy to commit federal health care fraud, wire fraud across state lines, money laundering, bribery of federal officials, obstruction of justice, and filing false claims against the United States government. Sentencing range, if convicted on all counts, is 30 to 40 years. A pause. "He's 61 years old." Emily understood what that meant without it being said. "And Voss?" she asked. "Similar range on the judicial misconduct and obstruction counts. His prior position as a judge is an aggravating factor under federal sentencing guidelines." Another pause. "There's also a motion before the state bar regarding his law license, which is a civil proceeding separate from the criminal case, but which his attorneys are anticipating given that he signed 11 fraudulent dismissal orders and 2 improper administrative court orders." Emily stood up. She moved to the window, the same window where 2 days ago she'd watched the street for a sedan that wasn't there anymore. The street looked like a street, regular, ordinary. "Dahl," she said, "what happens to the veterans during the 3 weeks before the grand jury?" "The VA task force is standing. Compensation review has started. The 30-day commitment from the Secretary's office is a formal directive now, not just a statement." "Are they being contacted directly? Not form letters? Actual contact?" "That's what Ashworth's task force is designed to do, yes." "Because some of them have been waiting a long time," Emily said. And a form letter from the VA is not going to mean anything to a man who filed a complaint 7 months ago and watched it get buried. I understand that, Dahl said. Not defensively. She did understand it. I want to be involved in the outreach if there's a role for me, Emily said. I know I'm a witness. I know there are constraints. But if there's a way for me to be part of reaching the veterans directly, not as an official representative, just as someone who knows what happened and can explain it in plain language, I want that. Dahl was quiet for a moment. Let me check with Collier on what's permissible given your witness status. I'll get back to you today. She did get back to her 3 hours later with a carefully worded arrangement. Emily could participate in a veteran outreach briefing organized by the VA task force as a non-official participant, providing informational context without speaking to specific case details that were sub judice. It was a narrow lane. Emily had worked in narrow lanes before. She spent that evening preparing. She wrote notes. Not a speech, just anchor points, the things she wanted to make sure she said in a way that landed. She thought about Gerald Pruitt, 64 years old, who had never complained. She thought about 841 people who had been failed by a system that had been deliberately broken, and what it meant to tell them that the breaking had been intentional, and that the people who'd done it were now facing consequences, and that the process of repair, while slow, had started and was real. She also, at 9:30 that evening, did something she hadn't done since this began. She sat down and wrote a letter to the Veterans Ward at Greyhaven. Not to administration, not to anyone who'd worked against her, to the patients, the ones who'd been there when she was there, the ones who might have since been discharged without knowing what had happened to their records. The letter explained in plain terms what the investigation had found and what it meant for their healthcare documentation. She forwarded it to Collier for review because anything she sent needed to be cleared. Collier called her back at 10:15. The letter is appropriate, Collier said. I'd suggest one change, Sheet. Remove the reference to specific billing code numbers because that's sub judice, otherwise it's fine. A pause. It's a good letter, Ms. Brooks. It's a necessary letter, Emily said. There's a difference. There is, Collier said. She didn't say anything else, but her tone was the closest thing to warmth Emily had heard from her. The veteran outreach briefing was held 2 days later in a community center on the east side of Ashridge, and it was not what Emily had expected. She'd expected a government meeting, chairs in rows, a lectern, a PowerPoint with too many bullet points, officials saying careful things in institutional language. What she got was a room with 47 people in it, some of them veterans, some of them family members, a few of them alone in the particular way of people who didn't have family to come with them, and a silence when she walked in that was not hostile, but was the specific quiet of people who had been disappointed enough times that they were waiting to see which kind of event this was going to be. She didn't use the lectern. She pulled a chair to the front of the room and sat in it, because she'd found that when you wanted people to listen to you, the first thing you had to do was stop looking like you were above the conversation. She talked for 40 minutes. She explained what had happened, step by step, without institutional language. She explained the discharge manipulation, what it actually meant that someone's file said they'd received treatment they hadn't received, what the practical medical consequences were, what they were entitled to now. She explained the compensation review process in terms that didn't require someone to have read the VA's administrative procedures to understand. She answered questions for 35 minutes after, and some of the questions were angry, which was appropriate, and some of them were heartbroken, which was also appropriate, and a few of them were so specific and practical. What form do I file? What number do I call? How long before I hear back? That she made herself write down every answer so she could send a reference document afterward. At the end, a man in the back of the room, she hadn't caught his name, he hadn't introduced himself, stood up. He was maybe 70. He had the build of someone who had once been larger than he was now. Were you a soldier? He asked. Army combat nurse, Emily said. 6 years. He nodded, just nodded. He sat back down. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to. She drove back to Marcus's house in the early dark and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. Not because she was upset, but because she needed the stillness. The briefing had done something to her that she hadn't anticipated. Not made her feel better, exactly, but made the thing she'd been carrying feel like it had a shape she understood. like the wait had a name and the name made it manageable. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize with a Washington, D.C. area code, different from Ashworth's. She answered. The voice on the other end introduced itself as belonging to a deputy assistant secretary at the VA, and what followed was a conversation she had not been prepared for. 15 minutes of carefully structured professional inquiry that asked, in a variety of indirect but unmistakable ways, whether Emily Brooks would be interested in a formal role in the newly constituted Veteran Emergency Services Review Board that the Secretary's office was establishing in the wake of the investigation. Emily listened to all of it. She asked 2 clarifying questions. She said she'd need to think about it and asked for the offer in writing. She went inside. Letitia was on the couch with a book. Marcus was in the kitchen. The house smelled like something cooking. "You look different," Letitia said, looking up. "Someone just offered me a job," Emily said. "A good one?" Emily stood in the doorway. She thought about the veterans' ward at Greyhaven. She thought about 841 people. She thought about Gerald Pruitt's daughter saying he never complained. She thought about the specific texture of a field hospital where the resources were wrong and the conditions were impossible, and the only thing you could control was whether you stayed and kept doing the work. "Yeah," she said. "I think it might be." She was still thinking about it an hour later, eating dinner at Marcus's kitchen table, when her phone lit up with a text from Collier. It was 3 lines. She read it once, then again. Farrell's legal team filed an emergency motion 1 hour ago. They claim to have evidence that the encrypted military contact protocol you used was not authorized for civilian use under your separation terms, and that your initial report was therefore obtained through unauthorized use of a federal communication channel. They're moving to have your contact report excluded from evidence and are arguing it taints all downstream evidence. Hearing is tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. If this motion succeeds, it unravels the jurisdictional basis of the entire case. Emily set her fork down. She read the 3 lines a 3rd time. The encrypted military contact protocol, the one she'd used because someone had trusted her with it when she left the service, and she'd trusted it in return. The one that, apparently, Douglas Farrell's attorneys had spent the past 48 hours finding a way to weaponize. She pulled up the original documentation from her separation from the Army. The paperwork she'd kept in a waterproof folder in the back of her closet for 6 years, because her training had taught her to keep the paperwork, always keep the paperwork. And she started reading. And 4 pages in a subsection she'd read once when she'd signed it and never looked at again, she found the language Farrell's attorneys were almost certainly pointing to. Her hands were very still. Then she found the sentence directly below it, in the same subsection, which Farrell's attorneys had apparently either missed or were betting she had. She picked up her phone and called Dahl. "I need you to pull my full separation documentation," Emily said, the moment Dahl answered. "The protocol authorization language, page 4, subsection 3C. A pause. "Why?" "Because Farrell's team found half of it," Emily said. "I just found the other half, and I need you to see it before 8 a.m. tomorrow." Dahl arrived at Marcus's house at 11:30 that night with a federal paralegal named Osei, who carried a laptop and said nothing, which Emily appreciated. Dahl sat across from her at the kitchen table, and Emily slid the separation documentation across. The actual physical pages, slightly yellowed at the edges from 6 years in a waterproof folder in the back of a closet. "Page 4, Emily said. "Subsection 3C, first paragraph." Dahl read it. Her expression didn't change. "This is what Farrell's attorneys are citing. The language specifies that the protocol is authorized for use in situations involving direct threat to active duty personnel." "Keep reading," Emily said. Dahl read the second paragraph. She was quiet for a moment. "Second paragraph extends the authorization to situations involving systemic harm to federal veteran patients receiving care under active government contracts," Osei said from behind his laptop, because he'd pulled up the same document and had apparently been reading ahead. He looked up. "Which is exactly what Greyhaven was, a federal contract facility under the Harwick government agreement." "Farrell's attorneys pulled the first paragraph," Emily said. "I don't know if they missed the second one or if they're betting the judge will only read what they cite." Dahl set the papers down. They're betting on the judge. They're wrong about the judge, Emily said, because you're going to have the full document in front of her before they finish their opening argument. Dahl looked at Emily for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite readable, but wasn't cold either. It was the look of someone recalibrating something they'd already assessed once. You kept 6-year-old separation paperwork in readable condition, Dahl said. I keep everything, Emily said. I learned it from people who understood that when things go wrong, the paper is usually what saves you. Osei was already building the evidentiary filing. He worked fast and without commentary, and Emily made coffee because it was almost midnight and none of them were sleeping anyway. And Marcus sat at the far end of the table and read the news on his phone and didn't insert himself into the process because he understood when his role was to simply hold the space. At 1:15 in the morning, the filing was submitted. The full separation documentation, both paragraphs of subsection 3C, with a legal brief from Collier's office, who had been called at midnight and had not complained about it, which said something about Collier, explaining the complete authorization language and why the protocol use was not only permitted but precisely appropriate under the second paragraph's terms. Dahl stood up to leave. She gathered the documents and paused at the door. Get some sleep, she said. I'll try, Emily said. It wasn't quite true. She slept 3 hours. It was enough. The 8 a.m. hearing was brief in the way that things were brief when one side had prepared for something and the other side discovered, mid-argument, that the ground under their feet was not what they'd mapped. Farrell's lead attorney, a man named Gerald Pruett. Expensive suit, the confidence of someone accustomed to emergency motions succeeding, had about 4 minutes of strong argument before the federal judge, a woman named Honorable Beatrice Wynne, who read at a speed that suggested she'd had the document since before dawn, asked him to address the second paragraph of subsection 3C. The pause that followed was the kind that had physical weight. Your Honor, Pruett said, the government's interpretation of that language is, Counsel, Judge Wynne said, not unkindly, I've read the language. I've also read the Harwick contract with the federal government, which is Exhibit 4 in the government's response. The facility was operating under an active federal veterans health care contract at the time of Ms. Brooks' report. The second paragraph's authorization terms are not ambiguous. She set the documents down. The motion is denied. The contact report stands. All downstream evidence obtained through the investigation it initiated stands. She looked over her reading glasses at Pruett. Is there anything else? There wasn't anything else. Emily was outside the courtroom when Collier found her, and Collier's version of pleased was a slight loosening around the eyes and a directness in her voice that cut through the professional restraint. That's the last procedural challenge they have, Collier said. Farrell's team has filed 4 motions in 5 days. They're out of angles. When does it go to the grand jury? Emily said. 2 weeks. We moved it up again. The volume of cooperation we have now. Collier stopped herself. 17 cooperating witnesses, Emily, including both VA insiders, Greer, Judith Reyes, and Winston Holt. The grand jury proceeding is going to be substantial. She paused. You should know that the federal prosecutor intends to recommend to the court that you receive formal recognition as a protected federal whistleblower with all associated legal protections retroactive to the date of your initial contact report. The paperwork is being processed now. Emily looked at the hallway. People moving past. Attorneys, clerks, a young woman with a stack of files who was moving too fast and was going to drop something, and did, and picked it up, and kept going. That means the termination at Greyhaven, Emily said, is formally contested under whistleblower protection statutes. Yes. Greyhaven's board, which has been reconstituted twice since Alderman's arrest, has already been notified. Their attorneys contacted the prosecutor's office yesterday about settlement terms. I don't want a settlement, Emily said. I want it on record that the termination was retaliatory and unlawful. Then that's what we'll pursue, Collier said. It was the cleanest, most unambiguous thing she'd said in 2 weeks, and Emily believed it. The grand jury convened on a Tuesday, and what followed was 3 days of closed proceedings that Emily participated in twice as a witness, giving testimony that she'd given versions of enough times now that the words came without effort. Precise, dated, factual, The same record she'd been building since the first night she'd sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and a suspicion she couldn't yet prove. When the grand jury returned its indictments, there were 19 names on the list. Douglas Farrell, Malcolm Voss, Richard Alderman, Sonia Kraft, Thomas Greer, who had entered a cooperation agreement and whose charges reflected that, significantly reduced but not eliminated, because cooperation bought you a lighter sentence, not an erasure. Winston Holt, Judith Reyes, the two VA administrative insiders, 8 additional individuals from Harwick's corporate structure, the appellate judge whose emergency injunction had failed, and 2 members of Voss's former judicial staff who had processed the fraudulent dismissal orders with full knowledge of what they were. The charges were read in open court. The press was present. The public gallery was full. Emily was not in the gallery. She was in a side room with Collier and 2 members of the VA task force, going through the compensation review status for the 841 veterans, because that was the work that needed doing, and the courtroom proceeding was being handled by people whose specific job it was to handle it. She'd said everything she needed to say to that process. Now the process needed to run. She heard about Farrell's face in the courtroom secondhand from Marcus, who had been in the gallery because someone should be, and Emily had asked him. He described it the way he described most things, without drama, just the facts of what he'd observed. He looked like a man who spent 2 years planning something and is now understanding that planning doesn't protect you from the thing you didn't plan for, Marcus said. Which was what? Emily asked. Marcus thought about it. Someone who documents everything. The Harwick government contract was terminated by federal order 4 days after the indictments, all 4 facility contracts. The termination was effective immediately, with transition management assigned to a federal oversight body, and every veteran currently receiving care under those contracts was formally notified and offered transfer to alternative federal facilities with full continuity of care documentation, real documentation, accurate documentation, built from the corrected records that the investigation had reconstructed from the Columbus server data. Emily was involved in the correction protocol. The VA task force had asked for her clinical input on the process of reconstructing accurate medical histories from fraudulent records, which was a specific technical problem that required understanding both the documentation systems and the medical realities they were supposed to reflect. She worked on it for a week in a temporary office at the VA's regional headquarters with a team of 4 clinical reviewers and 2 data analysts, and it was the most purely useful she'd felt since the last shift she'd worked at Greyhaven. She wasn't sleeping great. She was eating better than she had been. Her shoulder still ached in the cold. She spilled coffee on her keyboard twice in 1 week, which was bad even for her. She was doing the work, and the work was real, and she was not the person who had been written about in the Tribune as a misconduct subject, and she was not the person who had been ordered arrested in a courtroom, and she was not the person anyone at Greyhaven's former administration would have described as significant. She was also all of those people. They didn't cancel each other out. That wasn't how it worked. The formal federal whistleblower designation came through on a Wednesday in December, 31 days after the indictments. Collier called her at 8 in the morning to tell her, and then sent the official documentation by encrypted transfer, and Emily opened it on her laptop at Marcus's kitchen table. She'd been looking for her own place again, had 2 viewings scheduled for the weekend, and read her own name in a federal document that said, in the particular flat language of legal instruments, that Emily Brooks had acted in accordance with federal whistleblower statutes and was entitled to all associated protections, and that her termination from Greyhaven Medical Center on the 14th of October had been unlawful. She sat with that for a few minutes. Then she texted Marcus, who was upstairs. It came through. His response was immediate. Good. That was sufficient. The sentencing phase began 6 weeks later, after guilty pleas from 14 of the 19 defendants, including Greer, whose cooperation had been so complete and so documented that the federal prosecutor had recommended a reduced sentence of 8 years, which Judge Wynn accepted. The 5 who went to trial, including Farrell and Voss, were tried together on the core conspiracy counts, and the trial lasted 11 days. Emily testified for 2 hours on the 8th day. She wore the same dark slacks and plain blouse she'd worn to Voss's courtroom the first time, because she didn't have a different version of professional she was trying to project. She sat in the witness stand and answered every question directly and without elaboration and without anger. And when Farrell's attorney cross-examined her, she gave him the same quality of attention she'd given the government's questions, which was complete, focused, and entirely unmoved by the implication that she was anything other than what she was. At one point, Pruitt, attempting to establish that her military contact had been procedurally irregular, asked her why she'd trusted a 6-year-old protocol that she had no recent confirmation was still active. Emily looked at him. "Because the people who gave it to me told me it existed for exactly this situation," she said. "And I've learned that when people who do difficult work carefully give you a tool and tell you what it's for, they usually mean it." Pruitt moved on. There wasn't anywhere useful to go from there. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Farrell was convicted on all 11 counts, Voss on 9. The other 3 trial defendants on varying counts, all significant. The courtroom was the same one where Voss had ordered Emily arrested. The assignment had not been accidental, Collier had confirmed with a rare hint of satisfaction. And the gallery was full in a way that the civil proceeding 2 months ago had not been. Different kind of full. Heavier. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Farrell received 34 years. Voss received 26, with a mandatory minimum on the judicial misconduct counts that meant he would serve the larger portion of it. The others received sentences ranging from 4 to 18 years depending on their role, cooperation status, and what the presentencing reports had revealed about the duration and depth of their individual participation. The courtroom where Voss had pointed at Emily and said, "Arrest that nurse," was the same courtroom where he was told he was going to federal prison. She found out later that he hadn't looked at her during the sentencing. She hadn't been looking at him either. She'd been looking at the families in the gallery, the veteran family members who had come, some of them from out of state, who had taken days off work and arranged childcare and driven hours to sit in those wooden seats and watch the sentencing proceed. An older man in the second row wore a VFW cap and kept his hands flat on his knees the whole time, with the particular stillness of someone who had decided before he came that he was not going to let himself react until it was over. When the sentence was read, he nodded once, just once. And then his daughter, who was sitting beside him, put her hand over his, and he let her. That was Gerald Pruitt. Emily recognized him from his daughter's description. She'd never actually met him. She didn't approach him in the courtroom. Some moments weren't hers to enter, but as the gallery was clearing, he made his way to the aisle and he saw her, recognized her from the Tribune photo, she assumed, or from the VA briefing she'd given, and he stopped. He was a bigger man than she'd imagined from his daughter's voice, broader. He moved carefully, the way people moved when certain joints had been undertreated for long enough that compensation had become habit. He put out his hand. She shook it. "My daughter told me what you said to her," he said, "that I wasn't invisible." "You weren't," Emily said. "You were just in a system that was trying to make you feel like you were." He looked at her for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who had seen significant things and had not let the scene of them make him smaller, and that was its own kind of information about who he was. "How's your hip?" she asked, because she was a nurse and it was what came naturally. He almost smiled. "Better than it should be, given everything." He paused. "They said the compensation review is done. I got a letter yesterday." "Good," Emily said. "If you run into any issues with the follow-up care authorization, call the task force number directly. Don't go through the general intake line." He nodded. He started to say something else, and then didn't, and she understood that too. Sometimes the size of what you wanted to express outran the words available, and the only honest thing was to let that be visible. He walked away with his daughter. Emily watched them go. Outside the courthouse, it was December cold, the proper kind with teeth in it, and the press was there. Not as many cameras as the day of the initial arrests, but enough. A USA Collier made a brief statement on the steps. Commander Dahl stood to the side and said nothing, which was her natural mode in public settings. Emily stood further back, not hiding but not presenting herself either, because the statement wasn't hers to make. The process had made its own statement. A reporter Emily didn't recognize caught her eye and started moving in her direction with the specific purposeful walk of someone who has one question they really need answered. Emily had time to either stay or go. She stayed. Ms. Brooks, the reporter said, how do you feel? It was the kind of question Emily didn't love because feelings were complicated and television wanted them simple, but she thought about it, briefly and genuinely, because the question at least deserved a real answer. Like the work isn't finished, she said. 841 veterans had their care compromised. The people responsible are being sentenced. Those two things are both true at the same time. The sentences matter. The care review matters more. What comes next for you? Emily thought about the offer letter from the VA Deputy Assistant Secretary's office, which she had accepted 11 days ago. She thought about the role, Director of Veteran Emergency Services Review, a newly created position attached to the oversight body that had been established specifically in response to the Harwick investigation. She thought about what that would actually mean, the systems work, the policy arguments, the specific daily grind of trying to make a large institution do what it was supposed to do for people who had already given it enough. She knew what she was signing up for. She'd always known. The knowing hadn't made her hesitate. The same thing that came before, she said, just with better access to the rooms where decisions get made. She walked back toward where Marcus was parked 2 blocks over, hands in her pockets because she'd forgotten her gloves again, which was a recurring problem she apparently hadn't solved despite 6 weeks of increased personal stability. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. The city moved around her, ordinary, regular, people going where they were going with no awareness of what had just concluded 200 yards away. She thought about the first morning after the courtroom, when she'd stood in Marcus's kitchen in the dark and watched the street and calculated threats. She thought about the encrypted message she'd sent from her kitchen table. One message, because it was all she had. She thought about the veterans' ward on a night shift, the particular quality of quiet that wasn't peaceful but was necessary, the specific weight of caring for people who had learned not to ask for more than they were given. She thought about something her Army supervisor had told her once, a woman named Captain Reese who ran the field hospital with the particular combination of pragmatism and ferocity that the conditions required. Reese had said it during a debrief after a bad night, when several of the younger nurses were fraying at the edges and struggling with the gap between what they could do and what the situation needed. You don't have to fix everything tonight. You have to document it, stabilize what you can, and still be there in the morning. The morning matters. Emily had thought about that a lot in the past 6 weeks. The morning matters. Not because it was easy or because it resolved anything by itself, but because showing up consistently in the right direction. Even when you'd been fired and sued and ordered arrested, even when the sedan was outside the window and the motion was filed and the system you'd trusted had been deliberately broken, was the only thing that accumulated into something that couldn't be taken back. She was 31 years old. She'd been a combat nurse in 2 theaters. She'd been a floor nurse on a veterans ward for 4 years. She'd been fired, publicly accused, and ordered into custody in a courtroom full of reporters. She'd worked through the night on a federal evidence brief, testified twice in front of a grand jury, and stabilized a cooperative witness in a federal building elevator. She was not unscathed. She was not smooth or perfect or unmarked by any of it. Her shoulder ached. She still didn't sleep through the night. She'd need to find a new apartment and rebuild a normal life out of a situation that had dismantled the previous version of it entirely. But she had a job that would put her in rooms where she could change things. She had documentation, because she always had documentation. She had 841 veterans whose files were being corrected and whose care was being restored, and she had Gerald Pruitt's handshake, and she had the specific knowledge that one encrypted message sent from a dark kitchen at 11:30 at night had been enough. Because it was sent by someone who had earned the tool and knew what it was for and trusted it when nothing else was clear. The car was where Marcus had said it would be. He was inside with the heat running, and when she got in, he handed her a pair of gloves without comment. "You forgot yours again," he said. "I know," Emily said. She pulled them on. They were too big. His, but they were warm, and she wasn't going to argue with warm on a December morning in Ashridge when there was still work to do, and she intended to be there for it. She looked out the window as Marcus pulled into traffic. The federal courthouse receded behind them, and she didn't watch it go. She was already thinking forward. The task force meeting on Thursday, the care review protocol that needed her clinical input, the letter she still owed to the VA Oversight Board about establishing a direct reporting channel for veterans who encountered administrative barriers, because the lesson of Greer's buried IG complaint was that the channel had to be uncomplicated and it had to go somewhere real. There were people who had spent 3 years believing that veterans were a population who wouldn't push back, that the system's failure to respond to them was a permanent condition rather than a manufactured one, that the right combination of authority and paperwork could make inconvenient truths disappear. They had all of them learned at significant personal cost that they were wrong, not because someone powerful had intervened, not because the story had a hero who was larger than life, but because one person had written things down, in ink, in a personal notebook, and trusted that the record would matter when everything else was being taken away. The record always matters. That was the thing they never counted on. The people who build systems to silence other people always underestimate the ones who are quiet, because they confuse quiet with empty, and they mistake patience for passivity, and they never stop to consider that the person they are not watching might be the one who has been watching everything. Marcus turned onto the highway south. The city fell away behind them. Emily looked at the road ahead and thought, the morning matters. She was already there,